The morning air at Fort Campbell hung thick with humidity, the kind that made uniforms stick to skin before the sun even cleared the treeline. On the parade ground outside the 101st Airborne Division headquarters, 300 soldiers stood in formation, boots aligned, eyes forward, waiting for the new colonel to finish what everyone knew would be a long, tedious inspection. Colonel Marcus Hendricks was everything the rumor mill had promised, sharp-eyed, straight-backed, with a Pentagon polish that made even the senior NCOs nervous. He'd arrived 2 weeks prior with a reputation for discipline and zero tolerance for complacency. Now he stood at the podium with a folder in hand, reading through the roster of attached personnel with mechanical efficiency. Captain DeMarco, Operations. Present, sir. First Sergeant Wallace, Alpha Company. Present, sir. The names rolled on. The morning sun climbed higher. Soldiers shifted weight from foot to foot, sweat beginning to trace lines down temples and spines. Then the colonel paused. Staff Sergeant Rachel Vance, Logistics Coordination. His voice didn't change in volume or tone, but something in the way he stopped, the way his eyes lifted from the page and scanned the formation with sudden, sharp focus, made the moment stretch longer than it should have. In the back row, third from the left, a woman in her mid-30s stood slightly apart from the others. She leaned on forearm crutches, the kind with ergonomic grips and reinforced shafts. Below the hem of her rolled ACU sleeves, blade prosthetics gleamed dull silver in the morning light. Carbon fiber and titanium, functional and unapologetic. Staff Sergeant Rachel Vance didn't move, didn't shift. Her face was calm, almost blank, the expression of someone who'd learned long ago that the best way to survive inspection was to become invisible. But she wasn't invisible. Not to everyone. 2 soldiers in a row ahead of her leaned close, whispers barely contained. One smirked, nodding toward Rachel. Diversity higher, he muttered, just loud enough to carry. Another voice, further down the line. Desk jockey probably never even deployed. Rachel's jaw tightened, but she didn't react. She'd heard all before. The jokes, the assumptions, the casual dismissal that came with looking like someone the Army had broken. Colonel Hendricks stood motionless at the podium, his gaze locked on her. 3 long seconds passed. His jaw worked, a muscle ticking near his temple. Then, without a word, he lowered his eyes back to the roster and continued. Lieutenant Graves, Supply Chain Management. Present, sir. The inspection droned on. When it finally ended, the colonel closed his folder with a snap that echoed across the parade ground. We'll reconvene at 1,400 for unit commendations, he said, his voice carrying that command authority that made even suggestions sound like orders. All personnel present. No exceptions. He turned and walked off the field. The formation broke. Soldiers scattered toward their duty stations, voices rising in relief. Rachel turned, the motion practiced and smooth despite the crutches. She moved toward the logistics building, her gait measured, each step deliberate, efficient, the result of years of physical therapy and sheer stubborn will. A young lieutenant passed her on the way to the parking lot. He was close enough that holding the door would have been a natural thing to do. The polite thing, the respectful thing. He didn't even glance her way. The door swung shut in her face. Rachel caught it with her shoulder, pushed through, and kept walking. Behind her, the morning sun climbed higher over Fort Campbell. Ahead, the logistics office waited, fluorescent lights, requisition forms, and the kind of silence that came with being forgotten. The logistics office was exactly what it looked like, a bureaucratic purgatory tucked into the corner of a building no one visited unless they had to. Beige walls, flickering overhead lights, metal desks arranged in rows that hadn't been updated since the 90s. The air smelled like old coffee, toner, and the faint chemical tang of floor cleaner. Rachel sat at her desk near the back, surrounded by stacks of requisition forms, supply manifests, and parts requests that never seemed to end. A computer monitor glowed in front of her, displaying a spreadsheet that tracked vehicle maintenance schedules for the entire battalion. It was meticulous work, unglamorous, the kind of job that kept the machine running but never made headlines. She worked in silence, fingers moving across the keyboard with the same precision she'd once used for entirely different tasks. On the corner of her desk, half hidden behind a coffee mug and a stapler, sat a small framed photo. The glass was scratched, the frame cheap plastic, but the image inside was sharp. Rachel, years younger, maybe 25, stood in full combat gear in front of a mine-resistant ambush-protective vehicle, an MRAP with dust caked so thick on the armor, plating it looked like part of the desert itself. Mosul, 2007. She was smiling in the photo, one arm slung around the shoulders of a stocky sergeant with a thick mustache and laugh lines around his eyes. 3 other soldiers crowded into the frame. Specialist Hayes with his baby face and nervous grin, Private First Class Turner, who couldn't have been more than 19, and Corporal Diaz, who always kept a rosary tucked in his vest pocket. They looked young, tired, alive. Rachel stared at the photo for a moment, then turned back to her computer screen. The memories came in fragments when she let them. The weight of the metal detector in her hands, sweeping back and forth across the cracked pavement of Route Predator. Headphones pressing against her ears as she listened for the telltale electronic whisper that meant death buried beneath the road. The sound of Sergeant Kowalski's voice crackling over the radio, always trying to crack a joke to cut the tension before they rolled out. "Vance, if we find another daisy chain today, drinks are on you when we get back to Bragg." She could still smell it. The burning trash from the street side fires. The dust that got into everything, gear, food, lungs, until it felt like the desert was part of your DNA. The metallic stink of fierce sweat inside the vehicle before mission. And she could still feel the way her hands never shook. Not when everyone else's did. Not when they found the 3rd IED in a single morning. Not when the temperature hit 120 degrees and the weight of the gear felt like it was crushing her into the ground. Her hands didn't shake then. They didn't shake now. Rachel opened the bottom drawer of her desk and pulled out a small black case, the kind used for medals and ribbons. She didn't open it often. Didn't need to. She knew what was inside. She flipped the latch. A purple heart rested against black velvet, the gold profile of George Washington surrounded by purple enamel. Beside it, a combat action badge, a rifle surrounded by a wreath, the symbol worn by soldiers who'd engaged the enemy in ground combat. And tucked in a corner, worn thin from years of use and handling, an engineer castle insignia patch, the emblem of the combat engineers, the people who walked into danger so others didn't have to. Rachel's thumb traced the edge of the castle patch. The fabric was soft, almost threadbare. She'd worn it on her shoulder for 3 deployments. It had been on her uniform the day everything changed. A knock at the door pulled her back. "Staff Sergeant." She closed the case quickly, locked it back in the drawer, and looked up. A young captain stood in the doorway, holding a clipboard. He looked impatient, like her office was an inconvenience he had to tolerate. "I need you to push through an expedited parts request," he said, not quite making eye contact. "Generator repair for the training site. Division wants it operational by Friday." Rachel nodded. "I'll get it processed today, sir." "Good." He turned and left without another word. No thank you. No acknowledgement. Rachel watched him go, then turned back to her computer. She pulled up the requisition system and began typing, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency across the keys. This was her life now. Requisition forms, supply chains, spreadsheets that track parts and equipment for people who barely knew she existed. The woman who had once walked point ahead of convoys, hunting for bombs buried in roads that had killed dozens of soldiers, now processed paperwork in a fluorescent-lit office where no one bothered to learn her name. The contrast was so sharp it could cut. But Rachel had learned a long time ago that complaining didn't change anything. You kept your head down. You did your job. You survived. She'd survived worse. Over the next few days, the disrespect didn't fade. It escalated, small cuts that accumulated like shrapnel wounds. In the chow hall 2 days later, Rachel sat alone at a corner table, working through a plate of scrambled eggs and toast while reviewing a maintenance report on her tablet. 2 junior enlisted soldiers, privates, couldn't have been more than 20, sat 3 tables over, voices loud enough to carry. "How does someone like that even pass the PT test?" one of them said, laughing. "She doesn't," the other replied. "But she gets a permanent profile." Probably hasn't run a mile in years. Rachel kept her eyes on her tablet, kept chewing, kept her face neutral. She'd heard it before, would hear it again. The assumptions came with the prosthetics, with the crutches, with the visible evidence that her body didn't work the way it used to. People looked at her and saw limitations, saw weakness, saw someone the Army kept around out of obligation, not capability. They didn't see the hours in the gym, the physical therapy sessions where she pushed through pain that would have made most people quit. The fact that she could still ruck 20 miles with a loaded pack if she had to. She'd done it 6 months ago during a staff exercise just to prove to herself she still could. But proving it to herself was different from proving it to people who'd already made up their minds. Back in the logistics office, the captain who supervised her section, Captain Brenner, a man in his early 40s with a receding hairline and a perpetual expression of mild irritation, called her into his office. "Vance, I'm reassigning some of your duties," he said, not looking up from his computer. "I'm moving you to inventory audits and data entry full-time. Miller will take over the equipment staging coordination." Rachel kept her voice even. "Sir, I've been managing staging coordination for 8 months. We have the field exercise coming up next week." "Miller can handle it," Brenner interrupted. "You'll be more useful in the inventory role. Less physical demands." The implication hung in the air like smoke. "Yes, sir," Rachel said quietly. She left his office and returned to her desk. Opened the inventory database. Started working through line items of spare parts and consumables. Each entry a small reminder that she'd been pushed one step further into invisibility. The meeting 2 days later was worse. It was a planning session for the upcoming field training exercise, a week-long event where the battalion would run simulated FOB defense and convoy operations. 20 people crammed into a conference room, a mix of officers and senior NCOs, everyone jockeying for position and trying to look competent in front of the brass. Rachel sat near the back, taking notes on equipment requirements. When the discussion turned to vehicle staging, she raised her hand. "Sir, if I can make a recommendation, based on the terrain map, we should stage the recovery vehicles closer to grid November 7. If we have a breakdown on the northern route during the exercise, response time from the main staging area would be over 30 minutes. The room went quiet. Lieutenant First Class Jeremy Caldwell, 26, West Point graduate, with the kind of confidence that came from never having been told he was wrong, turned in his seat and looked at her with barely concealed condescension. "With all due respect, Staff Sergeant," he said, emphasizing her rank like it was an insult, "have you ever actually been in the field?" Rachel met his eyes, kept her voice level. "Yes, sir, I have." He smirked, glanced at another lieutenant, sharing the joke. "I mean recently." The implication was clear. Whatever she'd done before didn't matter. She was a desk jockey now, someone who processed paperwork and couldn't possibly understand real operational planning. Rachel said nothing. The meeting moved on. Her recommendation was ignored. The vehicles would be staged at the main site, exactly where bottlenecks and delays were most likely. She wrote it down in her notes and kept her mouth shut. But not everyone in the unit was blind. Later that afternoon, Rachel found herself in the motor pool, inspecting a Humvee that had been flagged for maintenance issues. She didn't have to be there. It wasn't part of her assigned duties anymore, but old habits died hard. She wanted to see the vehicle herself, make sure the work order was accurate. She crouched beside the rear axle, running her fingers along the undercarriage, checking for stress fractures and blast damage patterns. Her prosthetics pressed into the gravel, stable and solid. Her hands moved with the automatic precision of someone who'd done this inspection 1,000 times in conditions far worse than a motor pool in Kentucky. "You know what you're looking for." The voice came from behind her, deep, gravelly, with the kind of tone that came from decades of cigarettes and shouting over engine noise. Rachel glanced back. Sergeant First Class Dominic Torres, everyone called him Dom, stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching her with the quiet assessment of a man who'd been in long enough to recognize real experience when he saw it. Dom was Gulf War era, pushing 50, with gray threading through his high and tight and a collection of scars on his forearms that looked like they had stories attached. He ran the motor pool with an iron fist and didn't suffer fools. Just checking the frame welds, Rachel said, standing slowly. Work orders said possible structural damage, but it looks like surface rust to me. Dom stepped closer, looked at where she'd been inspecting, nodded. You're right. Some kid flagged it without knowing what he was looking at. He paused. Where'd you learn to check blast points? Rachel hesitated. Then, quietly, Mosul. Route clearance. Dom's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Respect, maybe. Or recognition. That's no joke, he said. Rachel shrugged. It was a long time ago. Not that long. Dom watched her for another moment. The way she instinctively traced the weld lines with her fingertips, the way she checked the frame mounting points without thinking, the muscle memory of someone who'd done this when the vehicles were full of people and the roads were full of bombs. You need anything, Vance? You let me know. Thanks, Sergeant. Dom nodded and walked away. Rachel stood in the motor pool for a moment longer, then headed back to the logistics office. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across Fort Campbell. She didn't know it yet, but forces were already moving in the background. In his office in the headquarters building, Colonel Hendricks sat at his desk, a service record file open in front of him. The name on the tab read, Vance Rachel M. SSG. He'd been reading for 20 minutes, his expression growing harder with each page. Combat deployments. 3. Iraq 2006 to 2007, 2008 to 2009. Afghanistan 2010. Unit 14th Engineer Battalion, Route Clearance Patrol. Awards: Purple Heart, Bronze Star, Combat Action Badge, Army Commendation Medal with Valor Device. And buried in the medical section, a single line that made his jaw tighten. Injured in action, March 14, 2007. Bilateral traumatic amputation, lower extremities. Medically retired, 2009. Recalled to active duty, limited profile, 2015. Hendricks closed the file, sat back in his chair, picked up his phone, and made 2 calls. The first was to the division commander. The second was to a unit in Virginia, to a personnel office that kept records on soldiers who'd served in specific high-casualty units during the surge. When he hung up, his face was set like stone. The field training exercise began on a Tuesday morning with the kind of organized chaos that defined large-scale military drills. Convoys rolled out toward the training site 30 miles west of Fort Campbell, Humvees and MRAPs kicking up dust as they moved through the mock deployment routes. Evaluators with clipboards tracked every movement, grading everything from vehicle spacing to radio discipline. Rachel wasn't part of the convoy. She'd been assigned to remain at headquarters, logistics support, paperwork, monitoring supply requests from a desk in the command tent. It was exactly the kind of role Captain Brenner thought she was suited for. Safe, out of the way, forgettable. She sat in front of a laptop, tracking fuel consumption reports and equipment status updates, while outside the tent the real training happened without her. Then, at 1,130 hours, the radio crackled. Base, this is Convoy 3-2. We've hit the IED scenario at Checkpoint 7. Role player has introduced a secondary device, requesting EOD support for assessment. In a command tent, the operations officer keyed his radio. Convoy 3-2, Roger. Be advised, primary EOD asset is committed at range 12. Stand by for alternate support. A pause. Then a different voice, tighter, younger. Base, this is Lieutenant Caldwell. The evaluator is saying the secondary device is unstable. We need someone with route clearance or EOD experience on site now. This is a graded event. Division commander is observing remotely. The tent went silent. Officers exchanged glances. The evaluators were watching. The division commander was watching. This was the kind of scenario that could make or break a unit's reputation, and they had no one qualified to handle it. Dom's voice cut through the radio chatter, calm and direct. Base, this is Torres at the site. We need someone who knows route clearance procedures. Now, Colonel Hendricks stood in the back of the command tent, arms crossed, listening. His eyes moved across the room, landing on Rachel at her desk in the corner. Staff Sergeant Vance, he said, his voice cutting through the noise. You're up. Rachel looked up, startled. Sir, I'm not. You're the most qualified person in this battalion right now. Hendricks' tone left no room for argument. Get your gear. You're rolling out. Rachel stood, her heart suddenly pounding. Around her, officers stared. Some looked confused. Others looked skeptical. She grabbed her kit from beside her desk. She still kept it ready, old habits, and moved toward the vehicle staging area. The Humvee ride to Checkpoint 7 took 12 minutes. 12 minutes of silence, except for the engine noise and the voice in her head reminding her that she hadn't done this, really done this, in years. Training scenarios weren't the same as the real thing, but the procedures were the same. The thinking was the same. Her hands weren't shaking. When the Humvee pulled up to the site, Rachel stepped out onto the dirt road that served as the mock convoy route. Ahead, a training replica of an IED sat partially exposed in the gravel, professionally made, realistic enough to be unsettling. A second device, the secondary the evaluators had introduced, sat 15 meters away, connected by visible command wire. Lieutenant Caldwell stood near the convoy vehicles, his face pale, his confidence from the planning meeting completely gone. When he saw Rachel step out with her crutches, his expression flickered between confusion and something that might have been panic. "Sir," one of the soldiers muttered, "I don't think." The colonel's voice crackled over the radio, hard and final. "She has operational authority." "Stand down, Lieutenant." Caldwell's mouth opened, then closed. He stepped back. Rachel approached the scenario slowly, her eyes moving across the setup with the same methodical focus she'd learned on roads where mistakes meant body bags. The evaluators watched from a safe distance, clipboards ready. Soldiers from the convoy stood in a loose perimeter, uncertain, waiting. She knelt beside the primary device, her prosthetics pressing into the dirt. It didn't matter that this was a training replica. The procedures were real. The thinking was real. She keyed her radio. "Base, this is Vance. I have eyes on both devices. Primary appears to be pressure plate initiated. Secondary is command wire, junction box visible at 11 o'clock from my position." "Roger, Vance." "Proceed with assessment." Rachel's hands moved across the device, checking placement, examining the wiring setup. She asked the evaluators questions in the clipped, technical language of render-safe procedures, questions most of the soldiers watching had only read about in manuals. "Junction box power source. Simulated battery," the evaluator replied. "Assume active." Rachel nodded. Marked the safe approach corridor with chem lights, the bright colors stark against the brown dirt. Directed the team on how to move, where to position, how to isolate the command wire without triggering the secondary charge. Her voice was calm, clinical, the voice of someone who'd done this when the bombs were real and the consequences were permanent. "Safe approach is northeast corridor, single file, 8-meter spacing. Do not cross the wire line." "Specialist Hayes," she stopped. Hayes wasn't here. Hayes was in the photo on her desk, smiling in Mosul, alive because she'd made the right call 17 years ago. She corrected herself. "Specialist Morrison, you're on wire trace. Follow the line to the junction. Mark it. Do not cut until I clear the primary." The procedures unfolded with mechanical precision. Rachel called each step, checked each movement, her mind running through the sequence the way it had hundreds of times on Route Predator. Finally, she stood. Keyed to radio. "Base, scenario complete. Both devices isolated and marked for render safe. Convoy route is secure." The evaluators conferred quietly, then one of them nodded. "Scenario complete. Mission success." The soldiers around her were silent. The same ones who'd joked in the chow hall. The same ones who'd whispered desk jockey at formation. They stared at her now like they were seeing her for the first time. Lieutenant Caldwell stood frozen, his face pale, unable to meet her eyes. Rachel gathered her gear and walked back to the Humvee. Her hands still weren't shaking. That afternoon, the full unit reconvened in the assembly hall at Fort Campbell for the commendation ceremony Colonel Hendricks had announced days earlier. The room was packed. Officers enlisted, support staff, nearly 400 people crammed into rows of folding chairs. The air was warm, thick with the smell of too many bodies in too small a space. Rachel sat in the back row, still in her duty uniform, exhausted from the field exercise. Her prosthetics ached. They always did after kneeling on hard ground, but she kept her face neutral. Around her, soldiers talked quietly, waiting for the ceremony to start. Colonel Hendricks stood at the front of the room beside a small podium. The division commander sat in the first row, along with several other senior officers. This was standard: unit commendations, certificates of achievement, coins handed out for routine excellence. Rachel had sat through a dozen of these. They were always the same. Hendricks began with the expected awards. A sergeant received a certificate for logistics excellence. A specialist was recognized for outstanding performance during a maintenance inspection. A lieutenant got a coin for leading a successful training event. The applause was polite, routine. Then Hendricks stopped, set down the stack of certificates, picked up a single folder. "Before we conclude," he said, his voice carrying across the silent room, "there's one more recognition I need to make." He looked directly at the back row. Staff Sergeant Rachel Vance. Front and center. The room stirred. Heads turned. Rachel felt her stomach drop. She didn't move. Beside her, Dom, who'd quietly taken a seat next to her minutes earlier, leaned close. "Go," he said quietly. Rachel stood slowly, her crutches supporting her weight. The room had gone completely silent. 400 people watching as she made her way down the center aisle. The sound of her prosthetics and crutches the only noise in the entire hall. It felt like the longest walk of her life. When she reached the front, Hendricks gestured for her to stand beside him. He opened the folder. His voice was steady, controlled, but there was something beneath it, an edge of emotion carefully held in check. March 14th, 2007. Mosul, Iraq. He paused, letting the words settle. Staff Sergeant Vance was a combat engineer attached to the 14th Engineer Battalion, conducting route clearance operations on Route Predator, one of the most IED-heavy corridors in the city during the height of the surge. Rachel's breath caught. She hadn't expected this, hadn't wanted this. On the morning of March 14th, Hendricks continued, her team identified a primary device buried in the roadway. While conducting render-safe procedures, Staff Sergeant Vance identified a secondary device, command wire detonated, positioned to target the clearance team during the operation. The room was frozen. Not a sound, not a movement. She had seconds to make a decision. Hendricks looked directly at her, and Rachel saw something in his eyes: recognition, respect, and something deeper. Grief, maybe, or rage at what had been allowed to happen to her here. She placed herself between the device and her team. She keyed the radio and told them to move. Then the device detonated. Rachel's eyes burned. She forced herself to breathe. Staff Sergeant Vance lost both legs below the knee. Hendricks said, his voice rougher now. But every single member of her team survived. Sergeant First Class Anthony Kowalski. Specialist Marcus Hayes. Private First Class David Turner. Corporal Elena Diaz. Every one of them went home because she made the call no one else could make. He paused. When he spoke again, his voice cracked just slightly. Sergeant Kowalski was my platoon sergeant in Afghanistan 3 years later. He told me about her every year on the anniversary of that day. Told me about the woman who saved his life, who gave her legs so he could go home to his daughter. Hendricks' jaw tightened. He passed away last year. Cancer. Before he died, he asked me to find her, to make sure people knew what she did, to make sure she wasn't forgotten. Rachel couldn't stop the tears now. They ran down her face, silent, unstoppable. Hendricks stepped forward and pinned a unit commendation ribbon on her chest, just above her name tape. "You've been invisible long enough, Staff Sergeant." The room erupted. Not an applause. It was something deeper than that. Soldiers stood. Some were crying. Others saluted. In the front row, the division commander stood and saluted her, his face grave and respectful. Lieutenant Caldwell sat pale and motionless, staring at the floor, his arrogance shattered. Dom saluted her from across the room, his weathered face set with fierce pride. Rachel stood at the front of the assembly hall, tears streaming down her face, and for the first time in years, she felt seen. Hendricks stepped back, dismissed. Later that evening, as the sun set over Fort Campbell and the temperature finally dropped below 90 degrees, Rachel sat alone on a bench outside the logistics building. Her crutches rested beside her. Her body ached in the familiar way it always did after a long day. Footsteps approached. Dom appeared with 2 cups of coffee from the dining facility, handed her one, and sat down beside her without asking. They sat in silence for a long moment, watching the light fade from the sky. "You didn't have to do that," Rachel said quietly. "The colonel did," Dom replied. "And Kowalski would have wanted it." Rachel nodded, took a sip of coffee. It was terrible. Army coffee always was, but it was warm and familiar. "He really asked Hendricks to find me." "Apparently so." Dom looked at her. "You save his life, Vance." He never forgot. Rachel closed her eyes. "I didn't save everyone. No one does." They sat in silence again. The next morning, things were different. Not dramatically. There were no promotions, no sudden transfers, no Hollywood endings. But the change was there, subtle and real. Soldiers held doors, made eye contact, said good morning. In the logistics office, Captain Brenner called her into his office and quietly reassigned her back to equipment staging coordination. No apology, no explanation, just the acknowledgement that he'd made a mistake. Lieutenant Caldwell approached her in the hallway outside the motor pool, his confidence gone, replaced by something that looked like shame. "Staff Sergeant, he struggled with the words. "I was wrong. About everything. I'm sorry." Rachel looked at him for a moment, saw a young officer who'd learned a hard lesson about assumptions and respect. "Apology accepted, sir," she said. He nodded, relief flickering across his face, and walked away. But Rachel didn't change. She still worked in the same office, still processed requisition forms and supply manifests, still showed up early and stayed late, doing the unglamorous work that kept the battalion running. The difference was that now people saw her, recognized her, understood that the woman with the prosthetics and crutches wasn't someone to be dismissed or pitted. She was a soldier who had given everything when it mattered most. A week later, Rachel sat at her desk in the logistics office, working through a vehicle maintenance report. The small black case sat open beside her keyboard now, no longer hidden in a drawer. Inside, the Purple Heart and Combat Action badge gleamed against black velvet. The worn engineer castle patch sat in a small frame on her desk, where anyone who entered could see it. She didn't need to hide anymore. Outside, Fort Campbell continued its rhythm. Formations and training exercises, deployments and homecomings, the endless cycle of military life. Somewhere in the distance, a unit ran morning PT, their cadence calls echoing across the base. Rachel returned to her work, fingers moving across the keyboard with the same precision and competence that had defined her entire career. There are thousands of veterans like Rachel, people who gave pieces of themselves in wars that have faded from headlines, who came home to silence, who wear their scars in jobs that don't make the news, who work in logistics offices and motor pools and supply chains, their sacrifices known only to the people who serve beside them. They don't ask for recognition. They don't demand respect, but they deserve both. Rachel Vance had been invisible for years, dismissed and forgotten by people who never bothered to ask about the patches on her uniform or the reason for the prosthetic she wore. But she wasn't invisible anymore, and every soldier who passed her desk, every officer who worked with her, every young private who saw her story would remember. Never assume you know someone's worth by what you see on the surface. The quiet professionals are everywhere. The ones who did the hardest jobs in the worst places and came home to keep serving in silence. They're still here, still working, still carrying the weight of what they did and what they lost. And they deserve to be seen.